My name is Matthew Gianni. I'm a co-founder of the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. I've also been a partner in several EU-funded projects, including the Midas project, looking at deep sea bed mining, and the Atlas and Atlantic projects, which are science-based projects looking at all aspects of open ocean and deep sea issues in the Atlantic Ocean. I actually was coordinator of the Greenpeace International Oceans Campaign or Oceans Program for 5 years prior to founding the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. And well before all of that, I was a campaigner and a commercial fisherman for 10 years. And yeah, just to say, I've actually, in response to Ben's question, I just realized this morning, I've got 45 years worth of experience on oceans related issues, starting from the year that I first began fishing. So it's been a while. I've been involved in this. Fisheries and related work. But at any rate, this is a slide of the membership of the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, just to give you kind of a snapshot there. Over 100 organizations worldwide, and including many which you would recognize: World Wildlife Fund, Worldwide Fund for Nature, I should say, Greenpeace International, Conservation International, Oceana, and many at a national and regional levels as well. So just a quick background on international oceans governance. Is by no means a comprehensive presentation. It's difficult to be a comprehensive presentation in the time allotted, but I'll try to give you a good introduction to things with a focus on fisheries. So the foundational instrument or treaty is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which, amongst other things, established the areas of national jurisdiction for the purposes of exploited fisheries, the so-called EEZs, which you see in blue, dark blue on this map, and the rest, the light blue, is the high seas. And just a few quick facts about fisheries. The world marine catch is about 78 million tons of over 2,500 species that are directly exploited. This was information in 2020. Approximately 95% of the marine catch is in EEZs and 5% is on the high seas, but I'll show you where there's actually quite a different sort of set of numbers when it comes to the straddling and highly migratory fish stocks. 60 million people directly employed, 600 million people dependent upon fisheries or aquaculture, so not just marine capture fisheries. Sustainable fisheries, according to the FAO, are estimated to be about 64% of exploited stocks. In other words, 36% are overexploited. And globally, aquatic foods provided about 17% of animal proteins and 7% of all proteins in 2019. And this is the importance of fisheries from the point of view of food security, as well as in terms of sustainability and ocean conservation. As part of the UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea architecture, you have the convention itself and 3 implementing agreements. The second of those implementing agreements is the 1995 UN Fish Stocks Agreement. And just here are some key provisions on the conservation side of things from the UN Fish Stocks Agreement. Obligations to prevent or eliminate overfishing. Obligations to assess the impact of fishing on target stocks and species belonging to the same ecosystems, and to develop data collection and research programs to assess the impact of fishing on non-target, associated, or dependent species and their environment. Obligations to minimize the impacts on such species, associated, non-target, and dependent species, to protect habitats of special concern, and, quote, to protect biodiversity in the marine environment. And an obligation to apply the precautionary approach, to be more cautious when information is uncertain, unreliable, or inadequate. And the absence of adequate scientific information shall not be used as a reason for postponing or failing to take conservation and management measures. And this is a key provision because this comes up a lot in my discussions with scientists that are advising governments on things like setting appropriate catch limits, establishing measures to protect other species in the environment, particular deep sea species, corals and sponges and so forth, where they say, well, we can't be sure. And my response is, well, you need to communicate the uncertainties, but recognize that the uncertainties are not something that detracts from the strength of your advice. To the contrary, it requires the fisheries managers and fisheries regulators to be more precautionary in the face of scientific uncertainty. So it's as important to communicate the uncertainties in the data or in the conclusions that you're drawing as scientists, in this case, from the research you've been doing, as well as the certainties, the probabilities, the things you're fairly sure about. And Article 7 of the Fish Stocks Agreement requires managing fisheries for so-called straddling and highly migratory fish stocks consistently between areas of national jurisdiction and the high seas. So there's actually, it's not just the high seas fisheries treaty, it's a treaty that governs these transboundary types of fisheries. This slide, just to give an example of the global architecture for implementation of the fisheries provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention and the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, are the regional fishery management organizations. And so you have two classes here I've got on this screen: the tuna, or highly migratory species regional fisheries organizations, such as the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission, the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, etc. And then you have the ones that basically manage almost everything else, with the exception of so-called anadromous or catadromous species and marine mammals. And those are the straddling stocks and demersal, often referred to as the straddling stocks RFMOs, such as the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization, the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission. Let me just get rid of this thing here. Up here, the Southeast Atlantic Fisheries Organization, the South Pacific Regional Fishery Management Organization, the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, etc. And although only about 5% of the fish that's captured, the marine capture fisheries, or catch from marine capture fisheries, comes off the high seas, roughly, and this is my best guess, because figures vary quite a bit on this, approximately 10 to 20% of the global catch of fish is taken off so-called straddling stock and highly migratory stock species. So, for example, you have jack mackerel here in the Southeast Pacific. And the fishery for jack mackerel it's a very large fishery, 1 million tons a year, more or less. And it takes place both here in the high seas area of the South Pacific Fisheries, Regional Fisheries Management Organization, but also within the EEZ of Chile predominantly. And so there's an obligation to establish a coherent management regime, quotas, conservation measures, bycatch measures, etc., consistently both within EEZs on the high seas. And again, up here in the Northeast Atlantic, several very large fisheries, the Atlanto-Scandian herring fishery, for example, or the blue whiting fisheries, are prosecuted both on the high seas and within EEZs. So again, obligations on both coastal states and high seas fishing nations and the RFMOs to manage these effectively. Next in my slide seems to, okay, here we go. So in addition to the UNFSA Fish Stocks Agreement and the provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention, you have a whole range of other instruments, both soft law, as David mentioned, as well as legally binding law or binding international agreements that relate to fisheries in some way or another. So you have a whole suite of international plans of action, voluntary guidelines, international guidelines, etc., that have been negotiated under the auspices of the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. So these are not technically FAO products per se, but products that are the result of a multilateral negotiating process held under the auspices of the UNFAO. You also have processes here, and I apologize, I've mixed binding international agreements with soft law international agreements with processes. But for example, the UN Fish Stocks Agreement establishes a provision requiring a review conference every 5 years. And out of that review conference comes a series of recommendations that states collectively agree to, both parties and non-parties to the Fish Stocks Agreement, that need further implementation or require further effort to be implemented in light of the obligations and provisions of the Fish Stocks Agreement. You have the Convention on Migratory Species, the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. And for example, in I think it was December 2022, just listed all 58 species, I think it was, of requiem sharks. So basically, by far the majority of the shark species fished on the high seas, at least, of the world's oceans, on Annex 2 of the CITES Convention. You have the Convention on Biological Diversity, which David touched on, the Global Biodiversity Framework, which calls for 30% MPAs. other establishing OECM, so-called other equivalent conservation measures, the EBSAs, the ecologically and biologically significant areas that David mentioned, and a continued commitment to halt and reverse biodiversity loss within that 2030 framework. And this is something that is not new. For those of you familiar with the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, the Rio Plus 20 conference that was held in Rio de Janeiro in 2012, again, that was a high-level commitment to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, both in oceans and, of course, on terrestrial ecosystems. So there are these political commitments that, in effect, serve as soft law instruments. And you have the BBNJ agreement, which puts its emphasis on, among other things, building ocean ecosystem resilience, including to adverse effects of climate change and ocean acidification, which Barbara mentioned, and also maintain and restore ecosystem integrity, including the carbon cycling surfaces that underpin the role of ocean and climate. And I cite this article in particular because it's part of the architecture of the third implementing agreement of UNCLOS to try to bring together some of the key provisions of the previous two and elaborate on the original provisions of UNCLOS itself in a sort of a coherent whole that would be cross-sectoral and designed to establish consistent, coherent regime for managing the impacts on biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And of course, you have the UN General Assembly resolutions and the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Again, Barbara mentioned the latter here. And just as an example of how the soft law and the hard law kind of interrelate is on the question of deep sea fisheries, which is an issue that I've worked on quite a bit with my colleagues in the Deep Sea Fisheries, the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. This is a coalition we started because of scientific concerns over the impact of deep water trawl fishing on deep water coral, sponge, and other so-called vulnerable marine ecosystems on the high seas associated with oceanic ridge systems, seamounts, and other sorts of underwater topographical features. And the core agreement that was reached in 2006, we took this campaign actually together with scientists to the UN General Assembly in the early 2000s through a process called the United Nations Open-Ended Informal Consultative Process, and managed to get the General Assembly to agree to call for action to deal with the problem that scientists were raising of the destructive impact of trawling on these deep water ecosystems, many of which may have been or are thousands of years old or longer, and which are heavily damaged, if not altogether destroyed, or can be by the deep water trawl activities. And the core agreement was states agreed to prevent significant adverse impacts on vulnerable marine ecosystems. Now, this applied to BB&J, high seas areas, through conducting prior environmental impact assessments before fishing is permitted, establish precautionary area closures to protect deep sea habitats and biodiversity where so-called vulnerable marine ecosystems are known or likely to occur. And that the use of that term likely was in recognition of the obligation to establish the precautionary approach. A move-on rule, which I won't go into, and to ensure the sustainable catch and minimize the bycatch of deep sea species. And in effect, this agreement was designed to implement in the provisions of the adapt and implement the general provisions of the UN Fish Stocks Agreement to the problem of, or the issue of, deep sea bottom contact fishing. And in 2009, a follow-on resolution was adopted to adopt and implement these measures. In 2006. Adopt and implement these measures or else do not authorize bottom fisheries to take place on the high seas. And that was in both 61-105 and the resolution adopted in 2009, 64-72. And as part of that process, states agreed to negotiate a definition of what they meant by significant adverse impacts, what constitutes a vulnerable marine ecosystem, how to do environmental impact assessments of deep sea fisheries, which had never been done before, through a process established under the UNFAO to produce, again, a soft law instrument, the International Guidelines for the Management of Deep Sea Fisheries in the High Seas. And that established detailed standards for conducting impact assessments of bottom fisheries, criteria for identifying vulnerable marine ecosystems, and criteria for determining whether and how significant adverse impacts to VMEs would or would likely occur. and they were subsequently endorsed by the UN General Assembly. And the key thing, one of the key things here is this is a science-based set of guidelines, in part because we, as well as a number of governments involved in this process, were successful in getting the FAO to agree to invite well-known international deep sea biologists and scientists to help formulate the draft text of these negotiations and to inform government delegations of the science behind the guidelines or the underpinning the guidelines during the actual negotiating process itself, which took place in 2008. And I think there are some parallels here with what the International Seabed Authority is trying to do, which I think Mila and Pradeep will probably go into in their presentations tomorrow. Barbara mentioned the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Again, to me, this is another area issue, a kind of an example of how a soft law instrument really does or can or should inform the implementation of the Law of the Sea Convention and its ancillary agreements when it comes to managing fisheries, as well as other types of activities on the high seas. And I particularly cite this, so SDG 14 is the Ocean Sustainable Development Goal. Target 14.2 states by 2020, sustainably manage and protect marine and coastal ecosystems to avoid significant adverse impacts. And they picked this language up from the UNGA resolutions on deep sea fisheries, including by strengthening their resilience and take action for their restoration in order to achieve healthy and productive oceans. Now, how do they do that? That's where the science comes in. That's where the scientific information and research is absolutely critical to informing meeting that target, whether in managing fisheries, based on the obligations contained in the Fish Stocks Agreement or other agreements, or managing other activities. And so just a kind of a final set of slides, which are by no means exhaustive, but science is a basis for policy and regulations, effective policy and regulations. And I should say, again, coming back to something I said earlier, science within the context of the precautionary approach. So recognizing what we can say for reasonable certainty based on the science, the best scientific information available, and what we still don't know and need to act on a precautionary basis as a result of not knowing in order to prevent damage or otherwise meeting the conservation objectives of international law. So baseline information for fisheries and for environmental impact assessments for other activities. Managing in fisheries, and in the case of deep sea fisheries, identifying and protecting vulnerable marine ecosystems, protecting biodiversity generally, in the context of halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030, as states have committed to doing, establishing MPAs, other equivalent conservation measures, the objectives of the BB&J agreement, elaborating on the ocean climate nexus fisheries and other uses of the oceans impacting the carbon sink, predicting future species and ecosystem changes at local, region, and basin-wide scales, and managing the impacts of deep sea bed mining. I couldn't help but throw that in, but again, Pradeep and Mila will be discussing this tomorrow. So how can you get involved? And here I've tried to kind of put some things together, which probably most of you are familiar with, or might be viewed as a non-brainer. Again, I think Barbara and Ben identified some of this, as did David in his presentation. But from my experience, a couple useful guides is one: identify how the multilateral or regulatory body actually works. When does the organization meet? Is there a scientific committee or advisory body? Are there intermediate bodies or meetings to review the scientific advice prior to the meeting of the decision makers? Are there subcommittees, subsidiary bodies, formal or informal working groups that feed into the meetings of the scientific committee and are the other bodies? And are there intermediate bodies or meetings to review scientific advice, et cetera, and so forth? And in particular, and I didn't actually say that here, I don't think I've got that, no, but find out what it is, what the agenda, look at the agenda of the body or the regulatory organization as it's coming up, and see what it is that the countries that are parties to this body are actually asking. What are they grappling with? What are the key issues on the agenda that you can then potentially feed into through a number of other ways, such as in participating in the process. So for participation, I've just thrown a few notes together here. Identify the country agencies that participate in the various committees, working groups, etc. relevant to the scientific advice, for example, or legal or technical advice, i.e. Ministry of Fisheries, Ministry of the Environment, a national ocean agency or fisheries agency, etc., and identify any intergovernmental or non-governmental observers involved in these processes. Scientific organizations such as the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, universities, institutes, or research projects, environmental organizations, NGOs, intergovernmental organizations, even industry associations. And it doesn't have to necessarily be the industry that's actually the subject of the regulation. It could be the industry that is being, another industry that is being impacted by, for example, failure to implement effective regulations. And try to work with those groups well in advance to see if you can get your research, the issues that you have identified as concern, into their agenda for the meeting in order that they can then put it forward for consideration and ideally, ultimately, some sort of decision making. And again, this follows from the previous point. Determine how best to integrate your research, scientific, legal, policy, or social into the decision-making of the organization through example, through, and it's a bit of repetitive here, but through an environmental or scientific NGO or industry association with observer status that you could join for the meeting or advise in advance or prepare a brief for that they can then use to argue the case that you think is important to be brought before the organization for some sort of decision-making or consideration or attention. Participate in a government delegation via the appropriate agency or ministry. You can also, and this can be very effective, and it's also a kind of a networking way into the process, even if you don't have formal status, but find organizations or entities that are organizing side events. And some of these multilateral organizations are much more open to this sort of thing, as well as to participation, than others. So, for example, to participate in meetings at the United Nations General Assembly, well, not the General Assembly, but the UN, sometimes you need so-called ECOSOC status, which means you need to basically be a multilateral organization for all practical purposes, and it takes 1 to 2 years to actually get approval for that status. Other organizations, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity and its conferences of parties, are much more open to civil society participation. But present information at a side event during a meeting. And often when we go to meetings, when I go to meetings, we do this ourselves as the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, or for that matter, as the I-Atlantic Project. And many others do the same thing. You hold a lunchtime event to present the findings of your research, the recommendations following from that research, in the hopes that, or to use as to then later lobby or work with specific government delegations or observer groups. And you can do this through a university or research institute that participates or provides advice to a national delegation or international regulatory process. And then finally, and I think I've forgotten whether it was Ben that alluded to this or maybe Barbara, but publish the results of your investigation or your work in the press, i.e. if you got a good paper out, do some research and see which journalists have actually reported on this topic, and then try to reach out to these journalists and work with them to say, hey, this is something that you've reported on in the past. This is a new development on issue X, and you might want to use this or see this as something that worth reporting on. And information in the press has an influence on what governments pay attention to. Work at the interface of science and policy to use your experience as a scientist and or a policy legal expert to translate scientific information and scientific research for policymakers. Again, understanding what kinds of questions they're asking or what the legal obligations are that they themselves have established through the regulations adopted by the organization or the general provisions of the UN Fish Stocks Agreement in the case of fisheries and other international instruments for other types of activities. And, you maybe become an advocate or an activist, as a scientist or a policy expert or a lawyer, work with an NGO. Bring your credibility with your professional training into that advocacy work, assuming you're aligned with what the organization is attempting to achieve, or you've influenced the organization to attempt to achieve something that you see as important, and participate in these processes that way at the national or international level. And one thing that came up in a kind of a Skillshare we did back for the Congress of Latin American Scientists was create an association or an NGO with like-minded individuals and experts, such as the founders of the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative actually did, and make it multinational and apply for observer status to multilateral organizations of relevance. So DOSI was formed, I think, in 2011, 2012. Christina Jurdy, Elba Escobar, Lisa Levin was a prime driver, Maria Baker, I think a few others. And they now have observer status with the International Seabed Authority and with a number of other international organizations, and are very, very influential in bringing the science into the policy arena. So with that, thank you very much. Obrigado, and open for questions.